The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, which was already suspicious because nothing good ever arrived on a Tuesday. Sarah Malik stared at the thick cream envelope on her kitchen counter, the kind of paper that costs more than her monthly electricity bill. The seal on the back was real waxed deep burgundy, pressed with what looked like a crest she didn't recognize. 2 intertwined letters. A crown above them. She turned it over twice before opening it, half expecting it to be some elaborate prank from her co-worker Dina, who had a long and documented history of being exactly that kind of person. It wasn't a prank. The Nightfall Foundation's annual gala. One name on the invitation. Hers. No +1 line. No explanation of how they'd found her. Just her full name, Sarah Amina Malik, printed in ink so dark it seemed to pull light into itself rather than reflect it. She'd heard of the Nightfall Foundation the way most people had heard of it. Vaguely. From the corners of conversations at industry events, whispered the way people whisper about things they admire but don't fully understand. It funded medical research, arts institutions, wildlife conservation, and 3 universities in 4 countries. Its annual gala was invitation only, held in a different city each year, attended by people whose names ended up in history books rather than social media feeds. Nobody knew who ran it. The foundation's public face was a rotating board of directors, none of whom gave interviews, none of whom appeared on panels, none of whom seemed to age. Sarah was a conservationist. A good one. She had 2 published papers, a small but respected name in ecological restoration circles, and a grant that was currently keeping 6 researchers employed in the Sundarbans. She was not, by any reasonable standard, gala level. She drove a 6-year-old Honda. She owned exactly 1 dress that qualified as formal, purchased for her cousin's wedding in 2019. She ate lunch at her desk. She went anyway. The gala was held in Vienna, in a building that wasn't on any map she could find, which she assumed was an error until she arrived and realized it wasn't. The venue was a converted palace, the kind that had been privately owned for so long that it had simply stopped appearing in public records. The facade was pale stone, lit from below by lights that made it look less illuminated and more like it was radiating something from inside itself. A receiving line of staff in identical dark uniforms stood at the entrance. Nobody asked her name. They simply looked at her, looked at something in their hands, and stepped aside. The interior was, she would struggle later to describe it accurately. High ceilings with painted scenes so detailed they seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. Candlelight, actual candles, thousands of them, in arrangements that should have been a fire hazard but somehow weren't. Music from somewhere, string instruments, live, floating above the crowd at a volume that felt personal, like it was meant for each individual ear separately. The guests were dressed in shades Sarah didn't have names for. Not black. Not navy. Colors between colors. She stood at the edge of the main hall for 7 minutes with a glass of something pale gold and fizzy that tasted like pears and something older than pears, and she counted the people who looked like they belonged there versus people who looked like her, confused, slightly underdressed, using the champagne as a social prop. She counted 1 other person in the second category. A man near the east wall who kept checking his phone and, then, putting it away with the expression of someone realizing the phone wasn't going to help. The rest of them, they moved through the room like they owned it. Not arrogantly. Just comfortably. The way people move in spaces they've been in 100 times, where every corner is familiar and nothing surprises them. They laughed at the right moments. They touched shoulders, exchanged words, drifted apart and together in a choreography that Sarah couldn't read. She was deciding between finding a bathroom to hide in and simply leaving, actually leaving, just walking out, attributing the whole evening to a very expensive mistake when the room changed. Not dramatically. Not with fanfare. There was no announcement, no sudden silence, no parting of the crowd. It was more like a shift in pressure. The way a room feels different when someone opens a window. A change in the air itself. She felt it before she saw the cause. He came in from a side entrance, not the main doors, which meant he wasn't performing an arrival. He wasn't dressed differently from the other men in the room, dark suit, no tie, shirt open at the collar, but the room rearranged itself around him anyway, the way furniture rearranges itself around a structural wall. People didn't stop talking. They just became slightly more aware of where they were standing. Sarah watched him the way she watched wildlife in the field. Still. Quiet. Trying not to telegraph the attention. He was tall in the way that read as structural rather than genetic, not just height but proportion, the kind of stillness in a standing person that suggested they had simply decided to occupy that space and the space had agreed. His face was, she catalogued it clinically and, then, stopped being clinical about it immediately. Jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as the building. Eyes she couldn't determine the color of from across the room. Dark hair, slightly long, not styled so much as simply there. Gorgeous in the way that makes you briefly forget your own name. He shook 2 hands. Exchanged 4 sentences with a woman in silver. Accepted a glass from a passing server without looking at it. And, then, he looked across the room. At her. Not in the casual scanning way people look across rooms at galas. He looked at her the way you look at something you've been expecting. Specific. Intentional. Like her being there wasn't a surprise but a confirmation. Sarah did not look away. She'd spent enough time in forests with animals that could smell fear to know that looking away was always the wrong move. She held eye contact for 4 seconds, which in gala terms was approximately 4 seconds too long, and then she looked down at her glass and took a drink of the pear thing and told herself very firmly that she was a professional scientist who did not lose composure over cheekbones. When she looked up, he was closer. Not close, still across the room, but closer than he'd been, and he hadn't passed through the crowd to get there. She hadn't seen him move. Which was fine. Big rooms. Distraction. Perfectly normal. The next hour was strange in a quiet way. She spoke to 3 people, a marine biologist from Oslo named Eric who spent 20 minutes telling her about bioluminescent fungi with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting his whole life for someone to ask, a foundation board member named Mrs. Chun who asked Sarah 3 pointed questions about her son Darban's work that suggested Mrs. Chen had read both her papers thoroughly, and a woman named Leora who handed Sarah a second glass of the pear drink without explanation and said only, "You look like you needed that," which Sarah couldn't argue with. Through all of it, she was aware of him at the edges of her attention. Not staring. Not approaching. Just present. Somewhere in the room. The way you're aware of a sound you can't quite identify. She stepped out onto the terrace at 9:30 because the room had gotten warmer and her heels had been a mistake and the city of Vienna below her was doing that thing cities do at night from a height, turning into something that looked like a map of constellations, all light and pattern, deeply indifferent to human problems. She was leaning on the stone railing, shoes off, one in each hand, thinking about the son Darban's grant renewal and whether she'd need to extend the timeline, when she heard footsteps behind her. She knew, before she turned, who it was. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking at the city with the expression of someone who has seen it before and still finds it worth looking at. Up close, the color of his eyes resolved itself, dark gray, the exact color of the sky in the last minute before a storm commits to itself. "You're not networking," he said. "Neither are you," she said. He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression, not quite a smile, too careful for that, shifted. "Fair," he said. His voice was, she filed it under things she was not going to think about and, then, thought about it immediately. Low. Unhurried. An accent she couldn't entirely place. European, maybe. Or something that had been European long enough to evolve into its own thing. "Sarah Malik," she said, not as a question. "I know," he said. She waited. "Ros van Voss," he said. Like it was information she might already have, which she didn't. Or she did, actually, she realized a second later. That name. The Nightfall Foundation. She'd seen it exactly once, in a footnote of an article about European philanthropic networks, listed as a founding member of something she hadn't been paying attention to at the time. She wished, acutely, that she had been paying attention. "You founded this foundation," she said. "Among other things." "You invited me." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her for a moment, not evaluating, or at least not only evaluating. something else in it. Something that felt less like appraisal and more like recognition. Your paper on mangrove restoration in stressed saline environments, he said. The second one. The methodology in section 4. She blinked. That's a very specific thing to read. I read specific things. She put her shoes back on because the conversation had become the kind that required shoes. That paper took 3 years. It's been cited 11 times. 2 of those are self-citations. It should have been cited more, he said, simply, like it was a fact that had bothered him. She looked at him. You invited me to a gala because of section 4 of a paper that 11 people read. 12 now. The city below them did its constellation thing. Somewhere inside, the string instruments played something she didn't have the name for. The air was cold the way Vienna air in October is cold, sharply, cleanly, with the faint suggestion of centuries in it. She was about to say something, she didn't know what, something careful and professional and appropriately measured, when the terrace doors behind them opened and a man came out with the particular velocity of someone delivering bad news. He was older, silver-haired, in the uniform of senior foundation staff, and he spoke in German to Razvan in a low, rapid stream of words that Sarah's conversational German, decent, not fluent, caught only pieces of. Delegation. Press. Early. Upstairs. Razvan's expression didn't change, but something underneath it did. He looked at Sarah. And then, he said quietly, in English, the words deliberate and strange and, without any preamble at all, I need to ask you something. And, I need you to know that I understand completely if the answer is no. She waited. There is a diplomatic delegation upstairs. They arrive 3 hours early. They will expect me to be accompanied. My intended companion for this evening cancelled this afternoon due to a family emergency, which is genuine and not something I am asking you to feel guilty about. If I walk into that room alone, it creates a situation. Political. Not dangerous, but complicated in ways that would take an hour to explain. Sarah looked at him. Then, at the staff member. Then, back at him. You need someone to pretend to be your date, she said. My queen, technically, is the phrasing the delegation would expect. Their cultural context is specific. She absorbed that. Your queen, she said. For approximately 90 minutes. I'm a conservationist from Lahore, she said. I study mangroves. I drove here from my hotel in a taxi that smelled like pine air freshener. I know, he said. You're also the most composed person at this event who isn't on my payroll, and you've been standing on a terrace in October in a formal dress with your shoes off thinking about grant renewals, which tells me you're not easily rattled. She looked out at the city one more time. The thing was, and she would turn this over for weeks afterward, the thing was, she wasn't afraid. She was something else. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a field before you walk into it. Not fear. Just the full awareness of a threshold. She turned back to him. 90 minutes, she said. 90 minutes, he confirmed. And then, you're going to explain the section 4 thing properly. Something in his expression, that almost smile, went a degree further. Yes, he said. I will explain section 4 properly. She picked up her glass. Finished the last of the pear drink. Set it on the railing. All right, she said. Let's go meet your delegation. She didn't know, walking back through those terrace doors with Razvan Boss half a step behind her and the string music swelling from somewhere above, that 90 minutes was going to turn into something considerably longer. She didn't know that the word queen was going to stop feeling like a pretense somewhere around the 40-minute mark. She didn't know that the staff member who'd delivered the message was going to pull Razvan aside on the way upstairs and say, in rapid German that she wasn't supposed to understand. She doesn't know, does she? About what you are. And she didn't know that Razvan was going to answer, quietly, in the same language, not yet. She knew none of this. She walked through the doors anyway. The delegation was from a country Sarah couldn't immediately place on a map, which bothered her more than it probably should have given everything else happening. Their full title, delivered by a man in a dark red sash at the top of a staircase that had no business being that grand, was the sovereign emissaries of the Veldenmoor Consolidated Territories, which meant nothing to her but clearly meant something to the 8 people standing in the upper hall, all of whom straightened almost imperceptibly when Razvan appeared at the top of the stairs. He had taken her arm somewhere between the 3rd and 4th step. Not her hand, her arm, just above the elbow, the faintest contact, a suggestion of steadiness rather than ownership. She had decided, in the seconds before reaching the top, that she was going to approach this the way she approached fieldwork in unfamiliar terrain: observe first, move slowly, speak only when necessary, and never, under any circumstances, let them see that you don't know what the plants are called. The lead emissary was a woman in her 60s, silver-haired and small-framed in a way that made her more formidable rather than less, the way some birds are, compact and precise and giving the impression that everything unnecessary had been stripped away a long time ago. Her name was Magistra Isadora Vale. She had the eyes of someone who had spent decades reading rooms and had gotten very good at it. Those eyes moved to Sarah immediately. Not hostilely. Assessingly. The way you look at something new that has been placed next to something familiar. Razvan said something to her in what Sarah identified, with the particular bewilderment of a person discovering a gap in their education, as a language she had never heard before. Not German. Not anything she'd studied. Older, somehow. Heavier in the vowels. Whatever he said made the magistra's expression shift a degree less guarded, a degree more interested. Then, the magistra looked at Sarah directly and said, in perfect English, "So. The Queen." The same, Sarah said, because it was the only thing that came to her and because her fieldwork instincts had kicked in and her fieldwork instincts had exactly one setting under pressure, which was calm and declarative. The magistra studied her for another moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It was a small smile, controlled, but genuine. "You are not what I expected," she said. "I rarely am," Sarah said. Razvan, standing just behind her right shoulder, said nothing. But she felt something from him, not physically, just a change in the atmosphere of his stillness that felt, impossibly, like approval. The next 90 minutes were strange in a way that became increasingly difficult to categorize as the evening progressed. Veldenmoor, she gathered from the conversation, was a small sovereign territory in Central Europe, one of those geographical anomalies that had survived every attempt at incorporation by neighboring states through some combination of treaty, strategic irrelevance, and, what the magistra described, without apparent irony, as the enduring inconvenience of our particular institutional arrangements. It had a governance structure that was at least partially hereditary, partial council-based, and included, apparently, provisions for alliances that required a ruling figure to present a companion at formal diplomatic occasions, a tradition the magistra called the acknowledgement, which Sarah translated mentally as proof of life and alliance and basic social stability, packaged in ceremonial clothing. Sarah sat at a round table with the magistrate and 2 of the senior emissaries and said approximately 4 things the entire time, all of them careful and non-committal, while Razvan managed the conversation with the fluency of a man who had been doing this for, she found herself thinking, absurdly, a very long time. Centuries of diplomacy, her brain suggested, and she filed that thought under things to examine later and probably dismiss. The strange part wasn't the performance. The strange part was that it stopped feeling like a performance around the 40-minute mark, almost exactly as she'd predicted to herself on the stairs. Razvan had a way of referencing her in the conversation that didn't feel constructed. He didn't say my companion or my colleague. He said her name. He said it the way you say the name of someone who was part of your mental landscape, without ceremony, as if it belonged there. He said, at one point, in response to a question about the Foundation's environmental focus, Sarah's work on coastal restoration is actually, Sarah, tell them about the Sundarbans. The methodology. She looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in it, not a challenge, not a performance cue. More like, I'm interested. I want them to hear this. I want you to say it. So she talked about the Sundarbans. She talked about the methodology in Section 4, the way the salinity gradients affected root systems, the 18 months of data collection in conditions that had included 2 cyclones and 1 very determined wild boar who had destroyed 3 weeks of monitoring equipment. She talked about the seedling propagation rates and the carbon sequestration projections and what it meant, in real terms, for the communities who lived in the delta. The magistra listened with her full attention, the kind of attention that is a form of respect. When Sarah finished, the magistra said, in a tone that had gone warmer than anything in the preceding conversation, "This is important work." "It is," Sarah said. "It's also underfunded and largely invisible to the people who make decisions about planetary futures, but, yes." The magistra glanced at Razvan. "I like her," she said. Razvan said, "So do I." Sarah did not look at him. She looked at her water glass and thought about mangroves and tried not to examine what had just happened in the room's temperature. The delegation left at 11:15, with formal bows to Razvan and, notably, to Sarah, the same bow, the same depth, which the magistrate's junior attaché later explained to Sarah quietly in the hallway was a diplomatic signal of recognized status, not courtesy. "You were acknowledged," the young man said, with the faint expression of someone still processing a surprise. "That hasn't happened with a visitor in," he stopped. "A very long time," he finished. Sarah stood in the upper hallway after they'd gone, the building settling into its quieter late-night register below, and tried to organize the evening into something sensible. Razvan came to stand beside her. "Thank you," he said. "The Sundarban's speech was genuine," she said. "I want that on record." "It was the best part of the evening," he said. "And, then, come. I said I would explain Section 4. He took her not back downstairs to the gala, which was thinning out by now, the string musicians packing up, the candlelight lower, but to a smaller room off the main corridor. A library, floor to ceiling. Books that had the particular smell of age and use, not display. A fireplace burning low. 2 chairs that had clearly been sat in many times by many different people over many different centuries, the way good furniture accumulates that quality. He poured 2 glasses of something that wasn't wine and wasn't anything she could name, set one in front of her, and sat down across the fireplace. "The methodology in Section 4, he said. "You developed a propagation matrix for stressed saline environments based on historical tide data going back 40 years. "Yes." "Where did you source the pre-1980 tide data?" "It's not cited." She looked at him. "It's cited. Appendix C. Appendix C cites a private archive. One that isn't publicly accessible." She was quiet for a moment. "How do you know it isn't publicly accessible?" "Because I tried to access it." "You tried to access the archive is a family collection. My grandmother's. She spent her career documenting the delta's hydrological changes. Nobody else has the full dataset." "I know," he said. "That's why Section 4 is the most important piece of mangrove restoration methodology published in the last 15 years, and only 11 people have read it." She looked at the fire. Then, at him. "Why does this matter to you?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of answer but preparation for honesty. "The Nightfall Foundation has been funding ecological preservation work for a long time. The work is important. But most of the methodology being funded is working from incomplete historical baselines. Your grandmother's dataset, incorporated into a reproducible framework, would change the baseline." "You want the dataset," she said. Not accusatory. Just clear. "I want the dataset to be in the world," he said. Accessible. Incorporated into the field. Not because it benefits the foundation. Because in 20 years, when this coastline looks different than it does today, the work that gets done in those 20 years should be built on the best available foundation." She looked at him for a long time. The fire popped once. 20 years, she said. At least. Most people who fund environmental work talk about 5-year impact cycles, she said. Most people aren't thinking about the right timeline, he said. She was going to ask him what he meant by that. She was going to ask him what timeline he was thinking about, and why his eyes looked like they had seen more than one lifetime of things, and why the magistrate's attaché had said a very long time and stopped himself, and why the staff member on the terrace had spoken in rapid German about something she wasn't supposed to know. She was going to ask all of that. Instead, Dina called. Her phone vibrated in her bag with the particular persistence of Dina, who had the instincts of a rescue dog and always called at precisely the wrong moment. Sarah looked at the screen. Let it ring through. Dina texted immediately, "Are you alive? I googled the Nightfall Foundation." Sarah, there are rumors about these people. Call me back. Sarah looked up from her phone. Razvan was watching her with an expression that was patient and careful in the way of someone who has had this moment before, the moment where someone begins to understand that what they're looking at is not quite what they initially thought it was. "Your friend," he said. It wasn't a question. "She Googled you," Sarah said. "People do. What do they find?" He considered this. "Inconsistencies," he said. "Things that don't add up. Photographs from different decades in which I appear the same. References to the foundation in records going back further than the foundation's official founding date. A pattern that is legible to people who want to see it and invisible to people who don't." She held her phone in both hands and looked at him across the low fire. "How old are you?" she said. Just like that. No preamble. No working up to it. He looked at her for a moment. "Old enough," he said, "that 20 years is not an abstraction for me." Her heart did something. She wouldn't describe it as fear. It was closer to the feeling she had on the terrace, that threshold sensation. The edge of a field. The full awareness of standing somewhere new. "Are you?" she started. "Yes," he said, before she finished. Like he'd heard the question before. Like it was one of a finite number of questions and he'd learned to answer it cleanly. The fire burned. Outside, the city continued being Vienna. She should have been afraid. She ran the checklist quickly and confirmed, not afraid. Which was either very brave or very stupid, or possibly, the thought arrived with the particular clarity of things that arrive when you stop arguing with them, possibly just accurate. Her instincts in the field had never failed her. Her instincts in this room were saying, "This is not danger. This is the thing that comes before understanding." She put her phone face down on the arm of the chair. "Okay," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Okay? Okay, you're what you are. Okay, you've been funding ecological work for apparently much longer than the Foundation's public records indicate. Okay, the delegation tonight called me your queen and, apparently that was a diplomatic acknowledgement of something I don't fully understand. Okay." She paused. "Now I have several hundred questions and I would like to ask them in order of relevance, starting with the Section 4 methodology conversation we were having before my friend texted me." He was very still for a moment. Then, the almost smile resolved itself, for the first time all evening, into something actual. Not wide. Not performing. Just present. Real in the way that real things are real after a long time of everything being surface. "Your grandmother's dataset," he said. "Tell me about her." And Sarah, who had walked into this building 2 hours ago as a conservationist from Lahore who drove a 6-year-old Honda and owned one formal dress and had never once been described as anyone's queen, told him about her grandmother. About Amina Malik, who had spent 43 years measuring water levels in the Delta, who had kept her records in a system of notebooks coded in a private shorthand that had taken Sarah 2 years to fully decode, who had believed, with the particular stubbornness of people who are right before anyone else's, that the coast would change and that you had to document the before if you were ever going to understand the after. He listened the way the magistra had listened. With his full attention. Like it mattered. Which, she was beginning to understand, was maybe the most important thing about him. Not the centuries. Not the diplomatic weight. Not the building, or the foundation, or the eyes that looked like a storm deciding itself. The listening. She talked until the fire went low. He didn't interrupt once. When she finally stopped, the room was very quiet, and the city outside was doing the things cities do at 2 in the morning, thinning down to its essential sounds, the ones that were always there under the noise. "She sounds remarkable," he said. "She was," Sarah said. "Then, she would have liked you." She had no patience for people who thought short-term. Something moved across his face. Not the smile. Something older than the smile. Something that looked, briefly, like the specific loneliness of someone who has watched too many remarkable people become past tense. Sarah noticed it. Filed it. Said nothing about it. I should go, she said, though she didn't move immediately. My hotel is on the other side of the city and I have an early flight. Where to? Back to Lahore. Then, the Sundarbans. We have a monitoring window in 10 days. He stood when she stood, which was, she noticed, not performative. Just how he was in rooms. The dataset, he said, walking her toward the library door. I'm not asking for access to it. I'm asking if you would consider building a framework around it. Something that other researchers could use without accessing the raw notebooks. Your methodology. Expanded. She stopped at the door. Turned back. That's 3 years of work, she said. I know, he said. The foundation would fund it. Fully. Whatever you need: researchers, equipment, field access. She looked at him. And, in exchange? Nothing, he said. The work existing in the world is the exchange. She thought about her grandmother's notebooks, 63 of them in a waterproof case under her bed in Lahore. The shoreline that would look different in 20 years. The seedlings. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking, he said. She walked down the grand staircase and out through the building's pale stone entrance and into the Vienna night, where the air was colder now and the city was going its dark and ancient way below all its lit windows. She texted Dina, I'm alive. Call you tomorrow. It's a long story. Dina responded in 11 seconds, how long? Sarah looked back at the building once. Light in the library window, 3rd floor, unmistakable. She got into a taxi that smelled like pine air freshener. She thought about 20 years. About 43 years. About timelines. About a man who had said so do I in a room full of diplomats and meant it in a way that had rearranged something small and structural in her chest. She thought about the notebooks under her bed. Airport, she told the driver. The city slid past. She didn't call him. She thought about calling him every day for 2 weeks, which is different from calling him, and Sarah Malik was a person who understood the difference between thinking about doing something and doing it. The thinking was noise. The doing was signal. She had built her entire professional life on that distinction. She went to the Sundarbans instead. The monitoring window opened on a Thursday, which was a better day than Tuesday for arrivals, though the Delta didn't care about days. The Delta cared about tidal cycles and salinity measurements and the slow, persistent arithmetic of whether there would be mangroves here in 20 years or whether there would be open water. Sarah walked the transect line she'd been walking for 7 years, took her measurements, processed her data in the small research station that smelled like mildew and generator fuel and the particular aliveness of a place doing important work without anyone watching. She did not think about Razvan Voss. She thought about him constantly. Not romantically, or not only. It was the Section 4 thing that kept surfacing. The fact that he'd read it. That he'd tracked down Appendix C and found the wall of the private archive and thought, this should be in the world. The fact that his timeline was what he'd implied it was. That 20 years came easily to him because 20 years was a unit of measurement he had used before, many times, in different decades, watching the same problem repeat itself in different coastlines on different continents. On her 6th day in the Delta, standing knee-deep in tidal water at 6 in the morning with her measuring equipment and the particular quality of Delta light that turned everything gold and provisional, she thought, if you had 400 years of knowledge about what happens to coastlines when you stop paying attention, wouldn't you spend it on this? She took her measurements. She went back to the station. She opened her laptop and sent an email. It was short. She'd written it in her head 7 times and each time it had gotten shorter until what remained was just the signal, stripped of all noise. She said, I'd like to talk about the framework. The Sundarbans dataset specifically, my grandmother's records for this delta go back to 1961. I've started thinking about the methodology for expanding it. Are you available to talk? She sent it at 6:47 a.m., Delta time. His reply came at 6:52 a.m. Not a form response. Not a scheduling request. Just, yes. Call me when you're ready. And a phone number. She stared at that for a moment. The efficiency of it. The fact that it felt, somehow, like the reply of a person who had been waiting for it, not eagerly, not impatiently, just present. Ready. She called him that evening, sitting outside the station with the river visible through the tree line and the sky going the color of hammered copper behind the mangroves. He answered on the second ring. Sarah. Razvan, she said. And then, because she'd been thinking about it for 2 weeks, you said yes before I'd finished explaining what I was asking. Yes, he said. Don't you want to know what I'm proposing? I want to know everything you're proposing, he said. I also would have said yes regardless. She looked at the river. That's not how you fund scientific work. No, he said. It's how you trust people. She absorbed that. The river did its river thing, unhurried, going wherever it was going. The 1961 dataset, she said. My grandmother started recording before the cyclone events of the early 60s. That puts her baseline 15 years earlier than the next closest continuous record for this delta. If I build the framework properly, if I digitize the notebooks and create a reproducible methodology for integrating historical handwritten records into current modeling systems, it's not just this delta. It's a template that works for any research site with similar documentation gaps. Which is most of them, he said. Which is most of them, she agreed. 3 years minimum, he said. Probably 4. Probably 4. What do you need to start? She had a list. She'd made the list in her head walking the transect lines, which was the best place she knew for making lists because the work of measuring occupied the hands and left the mind free. 2 additional researchers, ideally with archival backgrounds. A digitization setup robust enough for field conditions. Access to climate modeling software her current grant didn't cover. And she hesitated before the last item. What, he said. He'd heard the hesitation. My grandmother's notebooks are in Lahore. 63 of them. Some are fragile. I've been putting off digitizing them because the process needs to be careful and I haven't had the resources to do it carefully. I would need to be there. In Lahore. For at least a month. Yes, he said. I'm telling you it's a month before the fieldwork even starts. Sarah, he said. I've been waiting 15 years for someone to read your paper and follow through on it. A month in Lahore is not an obstacle. She was quiet for a moment. The copper sky deepened. You've been waiting 15 years, she said. For Section 4 specifically. For work that treats the problem at the right scale, he said. With the right baseline. Yes. And, before Section 4? What were you funding? He told her. He talked about the projects the foundation had supported over decades, not just environmental work, but the pattern across the work. The way each initiative had been, in some sense, preparation for the next thing. As if the foundation wasn't just funding isolated projects but building something larger, step by step, on a timeline that individual human careers couldn't hold. She listened the way she always listened, completely. When he finished, she said, you built the field conditions for my grandmother's work to matter. He was quiet for a moment. I suppose I did, he said. I didn't know it was your grandmother specifically. But, yes. That's essentially it. She thought about that. About 400 years of paying attention. About what it looked like from inside, watching the same problem across generations, funding one piece of the solution at a time, never being able to finish it within a single human lifetime but continuing anyway. Doesn't it feel futile, she said. Doing work you can't complete? No, he said. It feels like the only work worth doing. She went home to Lahore in December. The notebooks were exactly where she'd left them, the waterproof case under her bed, 63 volumes in her grandmother's handwriting, the shorthand system that Sarah had cracked in her second year of graduate school with the help of a notebook she'd found in her grandmother's desk labeled, without further explanation, key. She lifted them out one by one and stood in her childhood bedroom with the smell of old paper and the particular ache of things that are precious because the person who made them is gone. Razvan sent 2 archivists from Geneva. They arrived on a Monday, both in their 30s, quiet and professional, with equipment that unfolded from 2 cases into a full conservation-grade digitization setup in the spare bedroom. They worked carefully. They treated the notebooks the way the notebooks deserved to be treated, which is to say, like they mattered. Sarah supervised and digitized and decoded and cross-referenced and ate her mother's food and slept in her old bed and talked to Dina, who lived 20 minutes away and came over 3 times a week with the energy of someone who had waited long enough for this story to be told face to face. He's funding the project, Dina said, on her second visit, sitting on Sarah's kitchen counter eating almonds. Yes. Because of your paper. Yes. The paper nobody read. 12 people read it. Sarah. Dina pointed an almond at her. He is centuries old, possibly immortal, founder of a foundation that has shaped global environmental policy for decades, and he flew 2 archivists from Geneva to sit in your childhood bedroom and take pictures of your grandmother's notebooks because of Section 4 of a paper 12 people read. Sarah was quiet. I'm just describing what's happening, Dina said. I know what's happening, Sarah said. Do you? Dina said. Not unkindly. Genuinely. Sarah looked at the almonds. He invited me to talk about the work, she said. He is funding the work. The work is what's happening. Dina ate an almond with the expression of a person who had known Sarah for 15 years and was currently deciding how hard to push. The work, Dina said. The work. The work that required you to be in Lahore for a month, which means you've been in the same city as your family for the first time in 3 years, which means your mother has been cooking every day, which means I get to see you regularly. Dina paused. So the work is actively improving multiple lives. But you're not considering any of the other implications. I'm considering them, Sarah said. I'm choosing not to act on them prematurely. Prematurely. Dina said the word the way you say a word that doesn't belong in the sentence it's been put in. Razvan called twice that month. Once about the digitization process, specifically about the encoding system for the pre-1965 notebooks. Once about something that started as a question about the climate modeling software and became, somehow, a 2-hour conversation about migratory bird patterns in the Bay of Bengal, which was adjacent to his question but not exactly it, and neither of them mentioned that. He was, she noticed, carefully, against her better judgment, curious in a way that was structural rather than performative. Not asking questions to seem interested. Actually interested. The 2 hours about migratory birds were 2 hours about migratory birds. He had information she didn't have. She had information he didn't have. They traded it the way people trade things of equal value. At the end of the second call, just before they hung up, he said, the digitization is nearly done, you said? Another week, she said. And then, the Sundarbans. And then, the Sundarbans, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. I'd like to see the Delta, he said. If that's not, you want to come to the Sundarbans, she said. I've never been, he said. I've funded work there for 30 years and I've never been. She thought about that. 30 years of funding work you'd never seen. Yes, she said. Come. He came in February, which was the right season, cool enough for the work, the delta at low tide in the early morning showing its root systems like architecture. She met him at the research station, which looked worse in person than she'd mentally prepared herself for, the mildew smell, the generator, the general condition of a place that spent more of its budget on equipment than on its own infrastructure. He arrived without ceremony, in field clothes that were the right weight for the humidity, with a bag that contained, she discovered later, an obscene quantity of high-quality waterproofing equipment and 3 books about deltaic hydrology that were older than her university. You've done this before, she said, watching him unpack without asking where things went. Field research, he said. Different fields. Same basic logistics. She showed him the transect lines the next morning. He walked them without complaint, measured without being asked, said almost nothing for 3 hours and then, at the northern end of the second transect, stopped. He stood at the waterline where the mangrove roots went from visible to submerged, the light doing its delta thing around him, and he was very still in a way that wasn't his Vienna stillness. This was different. Older. The stillness of someone who has arrived somewhere that means something. She let him stand there. After a while, he said, she was right. Your grandmother. About what specifically, Sarah said, though she knew. About the change being faster than anyone was measuring, he said. I can see it. From here. What this looked like 30 years ago versus now. She looked at the waterline. You were here 30 years ago. No, he said. But, I've read what the people who were here 30 years ago wrote. Your grandmother's notebooks. I read them on the flight. She looked at him. You read 63 notebooks on a flight. I read quickly, he said. She looked back at the waterline. They walked back to the station without speaking, which was not awkward silence but the kind of silence that is itself a form of conversation, the kind that only happens between people who have stopped needing to fill space. That evening, sitting outside in the heat with dinner and the river sounds, he told her what he saw in the data. Not the summary, the specifics. He had processed 63 notebooks in one flight and he talked about them the way Sarah talked about them, with the same precision and the same underlying urgency, the same understanding that the numbers weren't just numbers. They were time. They were the record of someone paying attention when no one else was, because she believed the attention itself would matter someday. Sarah listened and thought about her grandmother, who had died when Sarah was 19. Who had pressed the key notebook into Sarah's hands 3 days before the end and said, in the particular directness of someone who has decided that time is not to be wasted, the coast is going to change. Keep measuring. She hadn't told anyone that story. Not Dina. Not her mother. Not the 11 people who had cited her paper. She told Razvan. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. Not uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of someone who understood what it meant to watch remarkable people become past tense. She knew, he said. She always knew, Sarah said. She just needed someone to still be paying attention after she stopped. He looked at the river. The framework you're building, he said. 70 years from now, there will be researchers using it to measure changes in coastlines that don't exist yet in their current form. They won't know your grandmother's name. They won't know yours. But, the methodology will be in the work, and the work will be the reason the coastline is documented well enough to understand. Sarah was quiet. That's what the long timeline looks like, he said. From the inside. She thought about that for a long time, sitting in the delta heat with the river going dark and the generator humming and the work waiting in the notebooks on her laptop. She thought about what it looked like from his inside. 400 years of it. Watching the coastlines change. Funding the work. Building the conditions for the next generation of understanding to be possible. Doing it alone, or not entirely alone, but in the particular aloneness of someone whose timeline doesn't match the people around them. The magistrate's attaché, in Vienna, she hasn't a very long time. She looked at him. He was looking at the river. The gala, she said. The delegation. You actually needed a companion that night. Yes, he said. But, you chose me specifically. Not someone from your staff. Not one of the other guests. He looked at her then. Yes. Why? He considered this with the same care he brought to everything. Because you were on the terrace with your shoes off thinking about grant renewals, he said. Because you were the only person in that building who was thinking about work that mattered and not about being seen to think about work that mattered. Because I had read Section 4 and I knew that whoever had written it was the kind of person I would want in that room, and then, you were in that room. She looked at him. And, because, he said, more quietly, it has been a very long time since I met someone I wanted to talk to after the meeting ended. The river went dark. The generator hummed. She thought about 63 notebooks. About 20 years. About 400. She said, I'm going to spend the next 4 years building this framework. And, it's going to be the most important work I've ever done. And, you're going to fund it. Yes, he said. And, at the end of 4 years, I'm going to want to know what comes next, she said. Not just for the work. He was very still. I need you to tell me now, she said, whether what comes next is a question you're willing to answer. Because I'm not interested in starting something I can't see the shape of. He looked at her for a long moment. The specific gravity of someone who has learned to be careful with things they want, because careful is the only way they don't lose them. The shape of it, he said slowly, is that it's longer than 4 years. How much longer? As long as you want it to be, he said. That's not an abstraction. She looked at the river. She thought about her grandmother pressing a notebook into her hands and saying, the coast is going to change. Keep measuring. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who measured. Who paid attention. Who built the record so that someone else could understand the change. She thought about what it meant to do that next to someone who was already on the same timeline. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay. Start with explaining the Voldemort territorial structure, she said. Because I've been thinking about it for 3 months and I still don't fully understand the governance model. Something moved through his expression, the full smile, finally, unguarded. Not the almost smile from Vienna, not the small real smile from the library. This was the smile of someone who hadn't expected to be delighted and was. It's complicated, he said. I read 63 notebooks in shorthand, she said. I can handle complicated. He started explaining. She listened. The river went dark and, then, darker, and the mangroves were shapes against the sky, and the monitoring equipment in the station kept running its measurements, keeping the record, the way it always did, patient, precise, building the baseline that would matter to someone down the road. The work continued. The coast changed. They were paying attention.